welcome to today. Climate change, we know it's a huge and varied topic, especially when we're trying to talk to people about it. We've picked out areas that both interest us and we find relevant to our work. And we'll be drawing on incredible research that's being done by a number of different organisations, all of whom are linked in the slides, and we'll also be putting links in the chat as well. So we can't expect to reach everybody with every sentence we speak and in every conversation or in every event we organise or every social media post we create, but we hope that during this workshop we'll be generating useful discussion that help everybody to communicate more effectively with a wider range of people. The idea is just to widen it. You might want to make it as wide open as you can. Hopefully we're going to be finding ways to widen it in whatever way you need to, in both communities and workplaces.
So from the survey of 130,000 people across the globe, 89% of people thought that their government should be doing more to fight global warming. And could you go to the next slide, Joanna? Just to dive a little bit deeper into this. So the survey also asked people if they would contribute 1% of their household income every month to fight global warming, and also what proportion that they thought their fellow citizens would do the same. So in almost all countries, people believed only a minority of their fellow citizens would be willing to contribute, whereas in reality, the opposite was true. More than 50% of citizens were willing to contribute in all but a few nations. So the global average of those willing to contribute was 69%, but the percentage of what people thought would be willing was 43%. And the gap between perception and reality was as high as 40 percentage points in some countries. So this slide just shows a little bit of a breakdown on some of the selected countries. There are some links there where you can find out more information about this research. There's also a quote there. So if you were to unlock the perception gaps, that would move us closer to a social tipping point amongst the public on climate issues. That's a quote from Niall McLaughlin from an organisation called Climate Barometer, who are a UK organisation monitoring and interpreting opinion insights on climate. And they also do a twice yearly survey of public and MP opinion on climate change. So why is this important? Why do perception gaps matter? So perception gaps encourage a spiral of silence in which even people who care about the issue shy away from discussing it because they rarely hear other people talking about it. And this then kind of reinforces that spiral. If few people around you are talking about a subject, then it is unlikely to be an existential threat requiring urgent action. So this means that there's a feeling that if something terrible and dangerous is happening, surely people would be talking about it, surely action would be happening. And then this is also compounded kind of by the media's long-standing underreporting and also misreporting on climate issues. People are instinctively drawn to majority views and are also more likely to do something if they think that other people are also doing it. And lastly, research shows that MPs continue to underestimate the importance of the environment for voters. Perception gaps mean that climate policies are not as ambitious as public sentiment. So an example is in 2024, 72% of the UK public supported onshore wind being built in their areas, but only 19% of MPs thought a majority of their constituents did so. So in summary, what we want to do is we want to normalise conversations around climate and create a social tipping point to meaningful action. So we're just going to look specifically here at people in the UK. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of an organisation called Climate Outreach. They are an organisation that look at public opinion on climate issues. In 2020, they produced a toolkit called Britain Talks Climate, which is designed for use by campaigners and communicators. This has been updated several times, and they recently just published a version, I think it was September of last year. So there's a new version out. We use this quite a lot at SCCAN. So the Climate Outreach Britain Talks Climate Insights Report 2025 found that 74% of people across Britain think climate change is important, and 68% of people in Scotland want us to be more ambitious in our response to climate change. I put in a table there, so I'll just go through some more of the insights from the report. So more people in Scotland worry about harm to nature and wildlife than any other climate impacts. That's 41% of people worry about harm to nature and wildlife. A quarter of people in Scotland thought mainly about impacts of climate change around the world rather than at home. Almost a fifth of those in Scotland don't see any impact of climate change affecting them in the next 10 years. That's slightly above the GB average. So one of the main things that this report indicates is just how much nature means to people. So this was the #1 issue of concern in both Scotland and the UK as a whole. And then on the next 2 points, there's like quite a lot to unpack there, obviously. But what stands out for me is quite concerning. It doesn't seem that people kind of really know what's coming in terms of climate impacts. This kind of also relates to an issue that we talk about quite often within our team, about how we communicate about climate issues and climate impacts while still being mindful of people's mental health. There's obviously a balance that needs to be struck between the moral imperative to warn people of the situation that we're in and being realistic and urgent and honest about that situation, whilst also being mindful that we're talking about things that are extremely kind of serious and scary. We kind of feel that as people holding this knowledge, we have a duty to inform people and keep people up to date on information, but we also need to do this responsibly by pointing them to tools to act or giving them support in various ways. And we also don't want to scare people so much that they become paralyzed and kind of unable to act. So, unsurprisingly, the way action on climate change is framed makes a huge difference to how much people support it. So I put in here an example from climate outreach of how messaging and language can have different effects. So we'll just look at each of the 3 kind of examples here. So by presenting something in technical terms, the example being their council setting a target to reach net zero emissions by 2045, excuse me, 50% of people supported that. By adding a basic explanation, their council setting a target to reach net zero emissions by 2045 by providing a cleaner and more reliable energy supply, improving public transport and creating new jobs. That then raised the support to 64%. And by giving a vision of better, by changing the statement to local climate policy that benefits people's health and happiness, makes their area safer to live in, and protects local nature while also working towards a sustainable future for our children and next generations. That then increased it to 78% of people feeling positively towards that vision. So what these examples show is the importance of making climate action clear and appealing to people. As we've just discussed, climate is often discussed in terms of really kind of dry words, technical terms, net zero, 1.5, COP. These terms can be really alienating for folk. So it's really important to use familiar words and terms that people use in normal conversation. Avoid using stats as far as possible because most people don't trust them. Also avoid using dates and acronyms. So just to summarize that up, avoid stats, jargon, dates, and acronyms as much as possible. But sometimes, obviously, you can't avoid all of those things. And I know at SCCAN we are sometimes guilty of using acronyms a little too much, but we're just trying to get a bit better at that. But that's a general rule. So kind of the main thing is to focus on why it matters and what it means for people's lives, which is what the last example there did really well. So it communicated the policy within the context of people's actual lives and painted a picture of the benefits that this could have to people and their families. Now, this is obviously very instructive, but let's not forget, this isn't lip service. Good climate action and policy really has the potential to improve society and to change people's lives for the better. So that's just always something that I keep in the back of my mind when I'm talking about these issues. So I just wanted to touch briefly on this piece of research and kind of the UK audience. So Climate Outreach have worked with an organisation called More in Common to carry out public research, and they've come up with these 7 British segments where they group society into 7 distinct audience segments based on people's values, core beliefs, and worldviews. It's a really, really interesting piece of work because they don't just look at people's political beliefs or age or demographics, but they look more at psychology, culture, and values and beliefs. Um, so based on updated research, they've changed the segments this year. Sorry, they actually changed them last year. So the More in Common report is called Shattered Britain, Making Sense of What Britons Want in a Country That Feels Broken. It's based on views from over 20,000 people, and it looks at what's making people kind of feel pessimistic, how they see a way forward, where there is both division and shared ground across issues in Britain. I really recommend giving it a read. I will say it's not the cheeriest piece of writing that you'll ever read, but it's really, really interesting. There's also a quiz that you can do to find out what segment you fall into, and there's like loads of great information about reaching specific segments. So it's a really great tool if you've been thinking about trying to reach different audiences. Here are the tips that will work kind of for most people. So these are the kind of more generalized tips for general framing if you're not, kind of trying to deep dive into one of the segments in particular. Obviously, there are other ways of framing that you can use when you're wanting specifically to speak to an individual segment, but these ones on this slide here are kind of picked out the more universal ones that you kind of shouldn't go wrong with in a general context. As I said, some of the tips are from Climate Outreach and some are from an organisation called HEARD, who are a communications agency who specialise in climate. And a few other tips have been picked up from other places and within our team. So the first one is protecting nature. This one's the biggie. We've kind of already discussed that when people were asked which climate change impacts they're most worried about, the highest by some margin is harm to nature and wildlife. 41% selected this as one of their top 3 worries. It's so important, in fact, that Climate Outreach actually changed the name of their report. It was previously called Britain Talks Climate, and now it's named Britain Talks Climate and Nature. So yeah, nature is a great place to have positive conversations. Also, just something to point out, do bear in mind that nature means different things to different people. So if you are in a coastal community, people may be more interested in fishing or the marine environment. If you're speaking to folk who live in a city, they might connect nature more with green spaces or parks. Gardeners might be more interested in having conversations about food or growing. So just, bear in mind that there are different kind of connotations to the word nature. Health and happiness. So you can talk about having a good life, well-being. These are all good words, positive words to talk about climate and to kind of segue into deeper conversations about climate. Exercise and being outside is very much accepted that that's good for health. So obviously, if you're working in active travel, you don't always have to talk about active travel in the context of climate. It could be, really kind of an embracing topic to talk about exercise in terms of active travel. Mental health being affected by climate impacts, that is also kind of widely accepted as an experience that people have. So that is kind of an okay thing to talk to people about. Doing our bit, it's accepted by most folk across the board that taking action on climate and protecting our environment is the right thing to do. Reducing waste, so waste pollution, sewage reduction is strongly supported across the board. I would also say a big one is food waste. You're going to struggle to find anybody who doesn't agree that food waste is a big issue. The one thing I would say about food waste is just to try and make sure to avoid negative narratives around poverty, which can sometimes pop up if you're talking about food waste. Future generations. So it's widely accepted that talking about people's children, grandchildren, that's a really strong motivator for most people. Normalising action, not inaction. We spoke at the start, 89% of people want their government to do more to tackle climate change. So really normalising that is the position that most people hold, normalising conversations and having conversations about climate is a really powerful thing that we can all be doing. Fairness. So people with less money shouldn't have to do as much and should be prioritised for support. Again, this is widely accepted by most people. We all know we've got a common enemy, so every segment blames big polluters for causing climate change. Lastly, acknowledge the gravity and be realistic. So people are very skeptical of false optimism. We need to be specific and tangible and highlight what has been achieved before and how things can change with the right choices. And I think it's becoming more important that we are being realistic in our conversations with people, whilst also, as I said previously, kind of keeping an eye on protecting people's mental health as well. And that can be quite a tricky line to follow. And it does, that situation does change with whoever it is that you're talking to. But that's just something to bear in mind. So just a couple of kind of larger points, always use down to earth language. So again, no stats, no jargon, no dates, no acronyms. Also local places. So I'm sure a lot of people here will be working in communities. So this is like really relevant. Talking about local places, it's like super useful in the context of community conversations. You can ask someone about their place, talk about your place, find a connection that way. I live on the Isle of Arran, and I was out last week at a coffee morning just chatting to folk about climate misinformation. I kind of wanted to see what people were thinking about it. And most of my conversations started off either about the weather, about potholes, which I haven't obviously got on this list, but seems to be a unifying topic. And people where people are from. And I had an amazing conversation with a woman who was from who'd moved to the west coast of Arran in 1978. And when I told her I was kind of there to speak to people about climate, she immediately started talking about how beautiful it was when she moved to this village, how it was a fishing village, about the herring that was in the sea. And she was very kind of nostalgic about it. And it was really stark to kind of talk about how life used to be and to note that these changes have happened in a small location, and even like the human connections had been lost between the island and the mainland, which used to exist because of the fishing industry. So yeah, local places is a great place to start talking to people. And it's kind of a really unifying and safe topic of conversation to start off having conversations with people about climate. I just want to talk about this concept called whataboutism, also known as wittaboutery, which is entirely a word that I've made up, but I think is apt. So whataboutism is when someone deflects, undermines, or derails discussions about climate by shifting attention to another issue, country, or actor. So I've popped some examples in there. So when somebody says, well, why should Scotland or the UK cut emissions when China or India pollute more? That's kind of a geopolitical deflection that's going on there. You care about climate, but you still drive/fly. So this is kind of like an individual versus systemic distraction at play there. When somebody says, why focus on climate when poverty/housing/health/any other issue is more important? That's looking to derail the conversation. Environmental groups shouldn't speak unless they're perfectly green. Again, this is like a dismissive strategy. It's kind of putting what you're saying through a purity test. And it's worth noting as well, sometimes these comments, these questions can be unintentional. And sometimes they can be like, intended to kind of put you off the conversation. So these types of interactions can derail constructive conversation about climate solutions. They create a false equivalence of potentially treating two situations the same when they aren't, and thereby ignoring different responsibilities or contexts. They reinforce misinformation and feed cynicism by framing efforts as pointless or hypocritical. They can also be incredibly frustrating, and I'm sure most people have had several conversations along these lines. So it's probably something that you recognize. So how to deal with this? So if you have a response, that's great. And if you feel qualified to be able to respond on the specific issue. But I think this goes back to what we were saying earlier. Nobody can know everything. So you can't have an encyclopedic knowledge about every single thing that is going to come up around climate issues. So the best way to respond is to just stay focused, acknowledge their point, kind of briefly and politely, and then steer the conversation back to what you're talking about, and then discuss solutions that can be taken locally or nationally. As Kirsty mentioned, this is a massive thing that we're kind of all experiencing at the moment, and it kind of refers to climate misinformation, but also just misinformation in general. So just very briefly, what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation? So misinformation is fake or inaccurate information and is spread by mistake. So it's by somebody who doesn't realize that they're spreading false information. Disinformation is false information that is deliberately intended or produced to mislead the conversation or the narrative. Chances are that we've all shared misinformation by mistake at some point or other, whether that's online or whether it's in conversations with people. Hands up, I know I certainly have, and it's been unintentional, but that's how insidious this issue can be. So I just wanted to go through some examples just to kind of set the scene a little bit more on misinformation. I realize most of you probably are kind of aware of these issues and have a knowledge on it, but I think it's really important. So with misinformation, it's often topics that fuel the culture wars that are more likely to be subject to misinformation. So again, I've just provided some examples, and I'll talk through some more specifics under each of these headers. So public health measures. So for example, vaccines, public health guidelines, air quality, they are all examples of common misinformation issues. Migration and asylum. These are often targeted with false stats or like really dehumanizing or hateful narratives. Gender, sexuality, and identity rights, for example, trans rights, gender recognition, and single-sex spaces are often subject to misinformation campaigns. Race, equality, and anti-discrimination policies. So when you hear people, talking about woke agendas, hate crime legislation, those are kind of examples around that area. Electoral integrity. I only need to say the name Donald Trump for people to kind of demonstrate a good example of how electoral integrity is subject to misinformation. That's a biggie. On the right there, I've put some climate specific examples. So climate action and net zero. So for example, heat pumps, low emission zones, renewable energy, just transition, wind farms, dietary change. That's quite a broad range of subjects. Environmental regulations. So examples are marine protected areas, national parks, recycling schemes. So does anybody remember the deposit return scheme that was kind of launched in Scotland? That was subject to quite a significant misinformation campaign, and it didn't proceed. So that was a successful misinformation campaign that really affected policy. Urban planning, transport and mobility. So for example, 20-minute neighborhoods, low traffic schemes, congestion charging, food, farming and animal welfare. So again, dietary guidance, rewilding can be controversial, agricultural regulation, and lastly, energy system changes. So the banning of gas boilers, grid upgrades, these kinds of things. So warning signs for you to recognize and possibly indicate that you might be looking at a topic that is kind of culture warish and liable to misinformation, as if there is a lot of outrage around the conversation. So it's probably easier to spot maybe online in the comment section, but if you're seeing that opinions rather than facts are the focus of kind of the narrative around these subjects, and if there's conspiracy theories attached to these narratives, that's a really kind of obvious red flag to just take a double take and maybe look into the background of the information that's being presented and question it. I also wanted to just mention salience. So media salience refers to the prominence or significance given to certain issues, events, or topics within media coverage. Now, salience is so powerful in shaping public perception. So when the media talks a lot about an issue, people see it as more important. So this focus then shapes public opinion and drives political debate, and it can really influence what decisions get made. So at the moment, like, there is a lot of salience around the issue of immigration, for example. It seems to always be in the news, and I don't want to get into a political conversation, but it's a very good example of a topic that is being spoken about and being given a lot of coverage. So yeah, why is this a problem? So climate misinformation and disinformation specifically is problematic because it can undermine support for climate action. We will be having a misinformation event coming up, which we'll refer you to at the end, and we will obviously provide links to that. And we have currently a survey on misinformation where we're just trying to ask some questions and see how people are responding to misinformation. So it'd be great if you could participate in that. So the next thing that we're going to discuss is climate adaptation. And I just want to highlight some recent work from an organization called the Climate Majority Project. They've just published the SAFER report, which stands for Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience. And this argues that the UK urgently needs a major shift towards proactive community-led climate adaptation plans to try to protect communities from increasing climate impacts. So the report is quite careful to emphasise that adaptation and decarbonisation are not competing priorities. It argues that local people and organisations should be supported and funded to prepare their own areas, and that this can also help build support for cutting emissions. So overall, the report calls for a nationally funded resilience plan rooted in local communities to prepare for climate disruption whilst also strengthening social cohesion and democratic response for systemic climate action. And so following on from that initial SAFER report, the Climate Majority and another organisation called the Glacier Trust have produced a resource looking at how climate communications specifically on the subject of adaptation have changed in the last 5 years, and have provided some insights on how this can progress. So kind of a lot of when we talk about climate action is kind of more about this climate mitigation, behaviour change, these kinds of things. There's not too much out there at the moment, or it's kind of still, it's kind of like an up and coming topic to talk about adaptation. So at SCCAN, we've been kind of very interested in the communications around that. So the Climate Majority Project believe that success in the climate movement can be achieved when this concerned majority, as they deem them, when this majority of people get involved. So that kind of refers to that 89% of folk that we were talking about at the start, this majority of people who are kind of wanting action on climate, but might, for whatever reason, not be super engaged in kind of pursuing that. So it's getting this majority of people involved, and they see climate adaptation as a really good way to do this. And, to really kind of promote the benefits that the co-benefits that adaptation can bring to communities. So they have a really positive vision around adaptation. And I've just picked out this quote, which is, "Adaptation is where agency lives." So the way I've kind of interpreted that is it's kind of like thinking about refocusing how we talk about adaptation. Because at the moment it's kind of talked about like like emergency framing, disaster planning. And instead of talking about adaptation that way, it's about kind of moving conversations around adaptation into kind of more everyday language and talking about it as in kind of the realms of fairness, preparedness, community, and like local places. So here are some of the recommendations from their report. I will try and batter through these. So the first one, so they've kind of there are other groups that they have recommendations for, but for the sake of this space, I've only included the environmental organisations and the public and kind of the themed recommendations. So for environmental organisations, they suggest that we should deepen the new narratives. So what they mean is to keep building on the idea that climate adaptation is about fairness, nature, community, and money. And we should be using real local examples that people can relate to and connect these to bigger systems changes, and really keep adaptation at the front and centre as an issue that kind of matters in people's hearts and minds. They suggest to increase in collaboration. I know SCCAN are always trying to do this, and I'm sure a lot of you are as well. So there's a big opportunity for different groups to work together. So we should all be working together, community groups, climate justice groups, nature funders should all be joining forces around this issue. And we should also, everybody within these groups should be highlighting that we're already living with climate impact. So coming back to that, kind of being realistic and honest with people that climate impact, we're already seeing these climate impacts. So the key question around this is how we adapt in a meaningful, practical way. And also really importantly, how we all talk about that. So again, taking that normalizing of conversation and just shining a light on it in terms of adaptation measures. We need to move beyond critique to implementation. So the UK, we need to move from planning things to actual action. So organisations shouldn't be afraid to criticise the government's lack of action, and also share real practical examples of adaptation that can be scaled up elsewhere. So for the public, they suggest that public should be demanding local action. So the idea is that encouraging individuals to engage with local authorities and demand that adaptation and resilience be a central part of local planning. That's from flood defences to green infrastructure. A shout out here, I did see that Dawn from Climate Emergency UK is around on this call. They're doing amazing work with their climate, the local authority scorecard, so you can actually go and see how well or poorly your local authority, your council and local authority is doing. I will include links to that as well. Co-create local action. So if councils aren't doing enough, communities can organise themselves. So obviously we've got this amazing network now in Scotland of the regional climate action hubs. People can engage in citizen science. There's community food growing and kind of local energy initiatives, so people can get involved on the ground in their local areas. Supporting campaigns on accountability, so support organisations engaged in legal challenges and campaigns that demand accountability for climate damages, and ensuring the costs of adaptation don't fall onto normal folk and communities. The thematic recommendations, so a greater focus on local practical solutions. So again, just sharing all these amazing examples and helping people to feel more empowered around this issue. Expansion into neglected sub-themes. So talking more about things that people aren't talking about. So talking more about things like insurance, climate risks, public health services that are being impacted by climate, supply chains, all these things which currently are kind of flying under the radar a little bit, just to kind of complete the picture on what adaptation actually involves. Story-led and community voices. So we need, again, more stories from people in communities who are already adapting, sharing those positive examples, but also learning and sharing cases where adaptation didn't work so well so that everybody can learn from them. And finally, more educational outreach. So making climate climate adaptation part of everyday learning. So not just for folks like us in this call, not just for campaigners and policymakers, but also in schools, health services, businesses, everywhere you can imagine. There is loads and loads of interesting stuff on their website. Again, we will share the links. Right, thanks. And just lastly, I wanted to just talk briefly about conflict. And I really just wanted to acknowledge that sometimes conversations around climate can be difficult. Now that's regardless of whether you're talking to somebody new that you've never met, or sometimes talking to members of your own family can cause a lot of stress. Not talking from personal experience at all there. So yeah, just acknowledging that, and it has kind of come up a little bit. So at SCCAN, we've just recently done some training. We just did a course called The Art of Navigating Conflict for facilitators. And it was run by a person called Viv at an organization called Connecting Wisdom. So one of the very first things that we did as a group was to just sit down together and share some of the ways that we support our own kind of regulation in conflict situations. And I just thought that it might be useful to give you the list that we made. So some of these were taking deep breaths, reminding ourselves that the situation is not necessarily about us, putting your hand on your belly. If you're inside, looking out of the window and connecting to the wider view. Mentally taking yourself away and moving away from that situation for a couple of seconds. Imagine your favorite place, yawning, even if it's a fake yawn, to settle the nervous system. And this last one, which I think is fabulous. Imagine and remember that we are on a giant rock floating in the vastness of the universe. So it was someone very poetic came up with that. So feel free to use some of these, or you can come up with your own and just take some time to think about that, you know, how to regulate your own emotions in these situations.
This list of climate conversation tips, I think we might have it as a PDF, but it'll also be in the slides. So you can look at it in more detail later. But it's all about really how to connect with somebody and find out from them what's going on from them, and see where bridges can be built on between people's values, between your values and the person you're speaking to.